Welcome to a Question Time special programme on Ukraine. On tonight's panel, Nadim Zahawi, the government's education secretary. His family, who were Iraqi Kurds, fled Saddam Hussein's regime in the 1970s. He arrived here in the UK as a migrant at the age of 11. Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, a trained lawyer and the first black Briton to go to Harvard Law School, elected to Westminster at the age of 27. He served under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and Keir Starmer. Helle Thorning-Schmidt, Prime Minister of Denmark from 2011 to 2015. The first woman to take the job and the first to lead her party. She advises a range of charities and international organisations and is co-chair of the Facebook Oversight Board. And Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, renowned expert on nuclear weapons and international history, author of several books including Ukraine and the Art of Strategy, and a member of the official inquiry into the Iraq War, Sir Lawrence Freedman. Good evening, welcome to my panel, welcome to our audience here in London. And before we start, I should just point out the obvious, which is that we are a man down at the moment. The Ukrainian ambassador, Vadim Pristaiko, has been called into an urgent meeting. He cannot be here at the moment. I think we all understand that. He is hoping to get to the programme before we end, but we have to be patient. We will see what happens. In the meantime, stepping into the breach, I'm delighted to welcome Olesia Kromeychuk, who's going to give us the crucial perspective from Ukraine, director of the Ukrainian Institute, and she is joining us down the line. Olesia, thank you very much for standing at the last minute. We very much appreciate it. And we're doing tonight's programme in response, of course, to the waging of war in Europe on a scale I think none of us ever thought that we would see. We're devoting the whole programme to what's happening in Ukraine. We have a precious hour, and my aim is to answer as many of your questions as possible. So I will ask our distinguished panel to be reasonably brief and on the point in order to help me do that. And of course, watching at home, if you want to join the conversation, you can do so in the usual way on social media at BBC Question Time. And let's hear what you've got to say as well. OK, we'll take our first question tonight, which is from Karen Penny.
Who believes that we can beat Putin and how?
Lawrence Freedman.
We can't beat Putin, but the Ukrainians can. I think the way that this war has gone has surprised a lot of people because Putin underestimated his opponent, had a sort of fantasy view of Ukraine that was informing his strategy, and the Russian tactics were arrogant. They believed that they could do this very quickly, and now they've found themselves in a real mess. And
given that Putin is not talking to any of us, how can we be sure that that was his strategy and it's gone wrong?
Well, I think you can be pretty sure what his strategy was in terms of the declared aims, which was demilitarization, neutralization, and essentially a coup, a regime change in Kyiv, and the way that the army moved in, the Russian army moved in on Ukraine, going straight to Kyiv in order to try to take it. And we know of groups that were there to assassinate President Zelensky. So I think that was very clear, but it obviously all went very wrong very quickly. And I think what we're seeing now is that the Russian army and air force isn't just what it was cracked up to be. It's struggling, it's having real logistic problems. One doesn't want to overstate those because it's still a very large army with, as we've seen, it was some terrible scenes with a lot of firepower, but it's certainly nowhere near where it expected to be 2 weeks into the war.
And Olesia, who believes we can beat Putin and how, crucially?
Well, I do think that Putin has essentially been beaten already, but I think that we need to remember while Ukrainians are winning this war already, and there's an enormous war effort put forward both by the army, the armed forces, the territorial defense, and civilians completely unarmed. We also have to remember that this is our war all over the world, that Ukrainians are fighting it, but we need to understand that we need to fight it together. This is a war not just against Ukraine. This is a war against democratic world, against democratic values, and against the rule of law. And I am speaking to you from London, but obviously my heart and my mind is constantly in Ukraine. And what I can share with you is that the sort of privileges and and freedoms that we have here are very fragile. They can disappear overnight if someone like Russia attacks. At the same time, we have them here. We're not under threat, immediate threat here, and we should be able to exercise them. And we can exercise them by putting pressure on our governments to make sure that we don't just sit back and do the minimum possible, but we do the maximum possible to prevent humanitarian disaster and to prevent this European war from escalating even further. And essentially stopping Putin outside of Kyiv so we don't have to stop him outside of Warsaw or even outside of Berlin.
So, David, can we beat Putin and how? I mean, we heard Lawrence saying, well, only the Ukrainians can beat him.
We must, because we've got to beat imperialism.
And how do we do it?
We've got to beat ethnic nationalism, and we do it by squeezing them as hard as we can and supporting Ukrainians with arms to continue the fight. And my strong sense from being in Kiev a few weeks ago and having been in the past is that they will fight. We heard from Zelensky. They will fight on every single street, every corner, right to the end. So of course we will beat him. And we beat him not just on behalf of them, we beat him because we must always beat the dictator, the autocrat, that won't allow people's own self-determination. And look, we should take heart that he built up these reserves, this big war chest. It's halved in the last week because the ruble has fallen. And we're squeezing the economy. Apple, McDonald's, everyone pulling out of the country. That's how we beat him. I wish there was not going to be another death, but there will be, sadly. But we will win in the end. We must. There's no choice.
Nadeem?
I think Ellis is right. I think Putin's already lost. I was in the Donbass in 2014 when he annexed the Crimea as part of our inquiry into UK-Ukraine relations. The Ukrainians will fight because they're fighting for justice. They're fighting for democracy, for freedom. Putin sees that as an existential threat. Democracy is an existential threat to Putin
but
and his cronies.
He has overwhelming firepower on his side.
Well, you're right, but when you send innocent Russian conscripts, not knowing why they're fighting their neighbour, when you have Ukrainians who believe that they have a right to freedom and democracy. He tried, by the way, you remember, to install a puppet government, but the Maidan put an end to that. He thought he could do to Ukraine what he did to the Belarus. That doesn't happen. It won't happen. I think David Lammy's right on this. We have to continue to support the Ukrainians militarily, to be able to defend themselves, and we are looking at how we help them defend their skies much better than they've been able to. The ability to take out his tanks, their strategic capability. They've been much smarter than the overwhelming Russian military in front of them. And I think he also miscalculated the global reaction. We, governments around the world, but also, as again David put it, the private sector, when Microsoft cancels software licenses, when Visa and MasterCard and Amex pull out of a country, when JP Morgan cancelled trading in Russian bonds, Putin is killing innocents in Ukraine, but he's harming the Russian people. There are now thousands of mothers, of families, who don't know why their sons are not returning home. So he will lose this, and ultimately it's justice that will prevail. I saw this in Iraq, where a dictator that lashes out at his neighbours. It never ends well for them. I don't know how long it will take. This is the first chapter of what may be a long book. But we will have the stamina. The Ukrainians are lions, and they're fighting like lions, and they will prevail.
So, Hella, the question is, who believes we can beat Putin and how? I think it's fair to say when this started, it was only 2 weeks ago, it feels almost like a lifetime, doesn't it? The sense was that Ukraine couldn't successfully fight off Russia. The firepower was just too overwhelming. Do you think that has changed? And how can Putin be beaten, if at all?
Well, first of all, I really understand the sentiment that we've all had, that we've been crying. when we've seen these images. We're seeing the whole architecture of European security crumble before us, or that's at least how we think about it. So we need a little bit of hope. And I also hope the evening tonight can give that little bit of hope. And I do think there are ways of actually getting hope back to us. I think you mentioned that the military strategy does not seem to have been working for Putin. But I also think something has happened in the world that you hadn't foreseen. We are seeing a NATO which was split between Europe and the USA actually coming together in a very forceful way. We are seeing the European Union, where Putin has been used to divide and rule. That has not worked anymore. Even Hungary, that normally are best pals with Putin, has condemned this attack. So we are seeing the European Union being more united than ever, and also more forceful and taking big decisions on sanctions, for example. And obviously we are seeing Germany joining now to be a complete NATO member and defending Europe. So I think so many things have happened over the last 2 weeks that should tell us that there is a way out here, because we have strong institutions. We also have the right people, more or less, leading those institutions, and we have a backlash from the world that I had not seen. I was Prime Minister in 2014, and I've not seen this backlash. So,
which is when Crimea was
exactly. I went to the Royal Engineers Museum today. Your work takes you many places, and I saw the map from Waterloo, and I couldn't help thinking that this is Putin's Waterloo. It might take a few years, but it will happen. I think you can't do what he's been doing and remain in power.
Karen, you asked the question. What's your view?
I think that he can be beaten, but I think it's going to take a very long time, and I think we probably need to do more to help. I think my view is we're happy to give them ammunition, and guns, but we're stopping the line at fighter jets, and I don't quite see the difference. I know that we can't fly the planes, but we could at least give them the planes.
OK. The man at the back there in the dark sweater.
I think Putin's military, he hasn't unleashed it fully, and he has the capability to do that. When will the West, or should the West, step in sooner than later to do something about that, rather than just these sanctions?
Should we be doing more? Lawrence Freedman, what's your view?
I think it's important to realise that an awful lot of Russian military capability is now in Ukraine, probably over 50% of their army. They're leaving other parts vulnerable in order to funnel all their activity into there. And I think also we should keep in mind the importance of the weapons that we've already sent. The anti-tank weapons and the anti-air weapons have made a real difference. On the point about why don't we send aircraft, I mean, there are moves afoot to get Polish aircraft to Ukraine. There's only any point in sending Soviet-era aircraft, because Western modern jets are not going to be able to be flown by the Ukrainian pilots, but they certainly could fly these Ukrainian
But the moves by Poland to try to make that happen, it looked like it was going to happen last night, and the Americans said, well, you never told us anything about it, so actually, no, it's not happening.
You need better coordination, we can say that. But also, a lot of the Ukrainian Air Force is still intact. It hasn't, again, one of the surprises of this war is we would have expected, as basic military practice, to take out the enemy air force.
So why aren't they shooting down that long convoy of tanks that we see?
Because it's a traffic jam, it's not a convoy. Right. It's completely stalled. They're out of fuel.
So they might as well just leave it there.
Well, they have been attacking it. They have been attacking
the man there in the jacket, yes. Yes, you, sir.
Hi. I think it's very apparent that Vladimir Putin has severely underestimated the heart, the soul, and the perseverance of Ukrainians. But I do have to agree with a couple of the comments in here this evening that there has to be a point when I feel as though we need to do more. President Zelensky has asked for more. He's asked for more support. What can we do to encourage that?
And Leslie, listening to this, are you... I assume you're encouraged by what the UK and other countries have done so far, But it's not enough for you?
No, absolutely. The support we've seen has been overwhelming, especially from ordinary people all over the world and here in the UK. It's been really touching to see just how supportive people are of Ukrainians and how they show solidarity. And sometimes it's not necessarily matched by their governments, which it is disappointing for Ukrainians to see. But what I wanted to point out, following on from the discussion that I just listened to, is that Ukrainians are putting up a really fierce resistance because they know what they are fighting for, and that is the country that they have been building since 2014 and that they want to live in, a democratic country with free and fair elections, with reforms. Putin's worst nightmare, it's essentially what he does not allow the Russians to have inside Russia. And they also know what they're fighting against, and that is the horrendous Russian occupation that we've already endured since 2014 in Crimea and in the Donbass. The sort of occupation where ordinary people can be kidnapped, can be arrested on trumped-up charges, can be placed in concentration camps, essentially, and tortured. The sort of occupation that nobody will allow to happen in the rest of Ukraine. And that's why people are so determined to defend their cities in every possible way they can. And the fact that so many civilians are joining the armed forces and the territorial defense is admirable, but is actually a really sad reality. I mean, people like myself, I'm a scholar, anybody really, and everybody is prepared to defend themselves because they feel alone. They feel like they are the only ones who will defend their country. And one last point that I'd like to make in this regard is that Putin reacts to the West's reaction. The reason why we are where we are now is because very little was done in 2014 and since. There was a lot of inaction in the West, and he is responding to that now. And he continues to respond. For instance, shelling humanitarian corridors, right? So not allowing food, water, medication to be brought into besieged cities. I mean, today we've seen in Mariupol a maternity hospital shelled. So babies and pregnant women were wounded and killed. Yesterday, what summarized the horror of the situation was that a brief ceasefire in Mariupol allowed people to bury their dead in mass graves, including children. And that was an improvement on the situation before, because before they couldn't bury their dead. So this shelling of humanitarian corridors proves that he will not spare any life, and he will not stop ordering his troops to do so unless he is stopped by the West. And also, he does not spare his own soldiers' lives. So Russian soldiers are cannon fodder.
Okay.
They've been like that historically. Historically, the Soviet Union never spared lives of soldiers in wars. So, human life is worthless in Russia.
Let's take another question. In fact, you referred to it a moment ago. Let's hear from Nicola Ezra.
What, if any, would be the red line that Putin would have to cross that would trigger NATO to reverse its policy against providing direct military support to Ukraine?
So there's a feeling, certainly from some of the question coming, that's what it could come down to. Now, Helle, you were Prime Minister of Denmark when Crimea was annexed.
Yes.
Did NATO do enough then? Presumably not, given what's happening now. And what could a red line look like now?
I don't know if we can blame NATO. I do think there was a reluctance in many European countries, including this one, to do enough back then. And I think looking back, I think we can conclude that we didn't do enough. We could have had harder sanctions. We could have broadened out the sanctions regime. And that's why I'm so keen that this time round, all countries that have dealings with Russia really have a strong sanctions regime.
But you said that, but in terms of a red line, so for example today, as Alessia mentioned, we have a maternity hospital in Mariupol. The pictures have been on the news this evening, a huge crater outside the maternity hospital, 17 people killed, some of them women in labour. We don't know the full total yet. Is there a point where NATO could intervene?
I can really understand why people are saying, why is this not in Afghanistan or Libya, where NATO countries got involved? The reason for that is because they were a symmetrical relationship. This is a more symmetrical relationship. We have the West against Russia. And that is why I think we have to go back to the NATO thinking, which is basically if there is any kind of violation of the territorial integrity of a NATO country, that is when NATO can go in. And that is also...
So no matter how bad it might get in Ukraine...
I don't know. I don't want to say that. I think this is so bad. It is so bad, so you can't... Can it get any worse to bomb a hospital? I mean, this is a war crime we're talking about. So I could go on about that. So this is really, really bad. But we also have to look at the consequences everywhere, in the UK, in Europe, everywhere, that it is, if you start acting without Russia having been going over NATO territory, it will be seen as NATO attacking Russia. And that's why we can't have a no-fly zone, because then you're talking about an all-out war. Okay. So we have to be very, very serious about how we talk about these things, because it could get to that stage.
I mean, incidentally, I said 17 people killed, 17 people injured, and we don't yet know how many people were killed in this hospital bombing in Mariupol.
But to bomb a hospital is a war crime.
Lawrence Friedman, can you see what a red line could be, if any? And I just wonder what history tells us about what that could be.
Well, you know, the first thing we might note is Syrians wouldn't be very surprised by this conversation, because hospitals were attacked by Russian jets in Aleppo, for example. They've been through it. This is not new behaviour. It's part of the way that the Russian Air Force, which doesn't quite have the number of precision-guided weapons that ours do, but it's part of a deliberate strategy. So we could also ask, why didn't we do more in Syria to confront Putin when he was doing these war crimes? I think we as a matter of practice, NATO is not going to get directly involved in a war with Russia. It's a nuclear power. Putin made a direct nuclear threat, and
how worried should we be by that?
We have to take it seriously. Look, this is a man who's been nurturing his grievances in isolation during COVID, who's taken a lonely decision, as far as we can see, with very little advice. And he's talked about nuclear threats in 2014. He's talking about them now. I don't think he's going to initiate nuclear war. But if it starts to become an existential threat to Russia, which a full war with NATO would be, yes, of course we've got to think about that. And just a sort of a final point is that the problem with just being able to attack aircraft more is a lot of the horrible things that are happening with artillery and missiles and so on. So it's not even... The difficulty is once you're in this and you're not getting the results you need from the first military effort, then you have to escalate as well, and one thing leads to another. So if I was President Zelensky, I would be asking every day for NATO to get involved. But in practice, it's not going to.
Okay. The man there in the dark jacket. Yes, you.
So wouldn't the red line be actually a stray bullet or a missile going into a NATO territory country? Wouldn't that be crossing that red line?
Would that be enough, David Lammy? I mean, because that's what Hela's talked about, that's what we keep hearing, is that a toe cap, any kind of intervention in a NATO country would be enough. But, of course, there can be accidents.
There can be accidents, and that's why, despite the horrors of all that's going on, there are actually lines of communication to avoid those accidents and to be able to de-escalate if they should occur. I think it's important to understand that we here in the West, and there's huge responsibility that comes with being a nuclear power, we basically use our soft power first and hard power as a last resort. Our soft power in this country are things like the BBC, things like the British Council, important efforts at diplomacy, and then hard power comes. Vladimir Putin's knee-jerk reaction is to go to hard power. And we've got to be careful that we don't escalate this and recognise that we are talking about a nuclear power. And that's not just on behalf of us in this country, it's on behalf of the global community. So as horrendous as it all is, we must remember that this begins and starts with Putin. He must face trial for his war crimes eventually, and we must do everything we can to make this as difficult and hard for him as possible. And that is why the sanctions and why the military support to Ukraine must be the consistency that we hold. And we must also, just one last, we've got to end the short-termism, because we live in a world where we can see it. We've got to rush in. We have to have faith and patience and be consistent with our approach too.
The man here, yes.
Yes, we've already had one near miss with the Zaporizhzhia power station, and now we're hearing that the power to the power station, the Chernobyl site, is being shut off, which is affecting the cooling systems there. Well, is that not a trigger as such? Because at the end of the day, nuclear clouds, they don't discriminate over which country they're going to go. It could end up anywhere, depending on where the wind's going.
I mean, the UN at the moment is saying that what's happening in Chernobyl is not affecting safety. But as far as you're concerned, is that a reason to go in?
That changed literally yesterday when the power to the cooling systems was closed down by the Russians. And they reckon that the whole plant was getting warmer than it should and levels were rising.
How worried is the government about that, Nadine?
It is reckless to attack indiscriminately the nuclear power plants in the Ukraine. The IAEA, who monitors very carefully at the moment, don't think there is a risk at Chernobyl on this. But Nicola, to your question, we are helping with defensive lethal weapons. So the 3,600 NLAWs that are really effective against Putin's tanks, the Javelin weapons, again, anti-tank, and then, of course, going further now...
Yes, but the question is not about what military support are we providing. It's what, if any, could be the red line that would trigger NATO to reverse its policy against providing military support and going in?
Well, first of all, the priority has to be to help the Ukrainian military defend Ukraine. So I was going to say that what the Defence Secretary announced today is that we're looking at Starstreak, which is a very effective anti-aircraft weapon. We're also leading on coordinating the actual supplies that are coming in now from across NATO countries into Ukraine in terms of defensive lethal weaponry to help the Ukrainian military, as well as, of course, aid into the Ukraine.
But is there any red line you can see?
The red line is a simple one. The red line is if Putin attacks a NATO country, whether it's the Baltics or any other country, then NATO will go to war with Putin. That is something that Boris Johnson has spoken about, and of course the US President and other European allies in NATO. That is the red line.
Vicky, you wanted to come back in.
Sure, but that wasn't with all due respect, wasn't my question. We understand that if we attack a NATO country, we have the relevant article, and we would. But what about Ukraine itself? I'm not asking about a NATO country. Is there any red line he could cross in Ukraine that could reverse our policy?
By which you mean that we would send NATO troops into Ukraine to help it fight the war?
Or is this just not possible?
I think you're saying no, there isn't.
What I'm saying is what Prime Minister is saying. Helen's saying that what we don't want to do is be in a direct confrontation between nuclear powers, NATO and Putin, unless we are defending a NATO country.
OK, you've made that point. So I just want to say we are going to be getting the ambassador of Ukraine, Vadim Pristaika. He has managed to break away from his meeting. We are very grateful he's going to come and join us. So, Leslie, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and being part of the programme at the last minute. We are very grateful. We've heard your voice. We've heard what you have to say. Thank you so much. For now, goodbye. Leslie, thank you. So the ambassador will be joining us down the line. We left a space and we can't actually make it here at the moment, but he'll be joining us down the line, and when we can get him, we will be speaking to him. Yes, the man there in the dark sleeveless sweater.
Yeah, just had a question following on from what David said about being careful to not escalate the war. Putin mentioned last week that the announcements of sanctions were like a declaration of war. So would that have any impact on what the UK government or other Western country governments would then impose in terms of the severity of the sanctions that they then put forward should the war continue to escalate? And
what are you thinking, that we should hold back from sanctions in case it rattles Putin's cage even further, or are you thinking we should go harder on sanctions?
Well, certainly it's it's one of those where you're not quite sure whether or not he's just saying that in order to kind of alleviate some of the sanctions that have happened or have come already, and maybe there's a threat of more coming. However, for me personally, I would probably say there probably needs to be more done in terms of sanctions. There probably isn't enough happening in terms of oligarchs here in the UK, for example, which has been spoken about. And so I think more definitely could be done.
Would that have any result, do you think, Lawrence Reed?
Well, it's important to note that Putin has mentioned economic warfare being waged against Russia, and that, in this case, hasn't stopped the sanctions. I don't think that's the reason why the sanctions in some areas aren't as tough as we might like. It's because of concerns about Western energy and so on that have been limiting factors. So in that sense, I don't think that's the problem. Can I just say on this general problem of at what point and red lines and so on, the thing you have to always remember about war is they go in unexpected directions and they have unintended consequences. So when you set something like this in motion, you can't be sure where it will end. So at the moment, we're very clear about what the policy is and that the Ukrainians will do the fighting, and hopefully from what we've seen so far, they will do it well. But things take different courses, and this is one reason why wars are a bad idea, simply because of these various risks of escalation. So though at the moment we have a very clear sense that there's no circumstances in which we would end up in war with Russia, and I think that will continue. Nonetheless, these things don't stop. If this thing doesn't stop quickly and keeps on moving on, and some of the situations around nuclear power stations and so on develop, you can't assume, and Putin shouldn't assume, that everybody will just stay clear.
Ambassador Prusaka, we can see you now. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Your time is very precious. We're very grateful that you come to share some of it with us this evening, albeit not in person, but we're very glad to have you down the line. I just want to fill you in on what we've been discussing. We've had a couple of questions. One on can Putin be beaten and how? And is there a red line which, should it be crossed, NATO would reverse its policy at the moment and actually intervene? I just wondered what your view is.
Thank you very much for having me. Sorry I couldn't be with you in the studio. Just wanted to tell you on this both that actually Putin can be beaten. Each and every dictator can be beaten, if not from outside, but by his own people or her own people. And I believe that's one of the lines which he is getting very fast, very close. He's throwing more and more young boys into this mint grinder, which is becoming Ukraine for all his forces. We are losing people, we're losing our cities, but we're actually fighting. And I believe that there is something which not just could be done, but should be done to stop it for the sake of his own people. And what is the red line for NATO to come in helping us? I believe that, bombing, for example, the maternity hospitals, this is already a very red line. Going against people who are already now trying to get through the borders of Ukraine with the West, with the Western, our neighbors. If anything happens to these people, this is a very red line. The nuclear station, which is this one biggest in Europe. And if anything happens, Ukrainians after the Chernobyl are the people who can tell what can happen. All of these are very red lines. We don't want him to cross, and the sooner we tell him, the better. If you ask me who can tell him, I guess that nations who promised us to defend us when we gave up the nuclear weapons, these people should tell. Remember these United States, United Kingdom, and later on China and France who joined the memorandum. This not just can, they have to, by our agreement. We gave very real nuclear weapons, and we are not defended in return.
And this was an agreement, of course, in 1994 that you're referring to. There are talks tomorrow, I just wanted to ask, since we have you, between the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia. They're going to be the first face-to-face talks since the start of the conflict. What hope do you hold out for that meeting tomorrow?
What we're trying to resolve right now, we wanted our people to be given a chance to survive, and mostly civilians. We wanted to establish the humanitarian corridors to allow people in and supplies for those ones who stayed in besieged cities, and unfortunately in sort of medieval way. That's our priority number one. And we wanted to stop the war. We wanted to hear what they can come up with, but we do not believe that there are some compromises can be given on our side. We've tried it for 8 years to give all the compromises, and unfortunately, it didn't work. They came with war against us and killing people as we speak.
OK, let's take a question now from James Jones. James, where are you?
So people are being bombed, they're losing everything, and they manage to make it to safety. We then ask them to go through all of the admin of bringing paperwork, having meetings. How can that be right, that it's got to take that long to get them to a safe place?
Is it a success, would you say, Nadeem, the policy towards bringing refugees in from Ukraine?
So, James, you raise a really important point on this, and what you are seeing now is a surge in our capability to take more Ukrainians in, both through the family reunion. We can bring any member of the family, cousins, grandparents, through that route, and then, of course, the humanitarian
that's
route,
not been set up yet, and could take weeks, I understand.
Well, Michael Gove will announce it. The family reunion route will be hundreds of thousands. I can tell you, in my own department, in education, I have a team that's already making plans for a capacity of 100,000 children that we will take into our schools. Now,
they've got to get here first.
Well, I'm about to address that. Your question is around, should we be conducting checks or not? Now,
no, the question was about all the paperwork, I think.
And the paperwork, we had to stand it up last Friday. By Friday night, people were actually getting their visas and coming in. On the same day, we're surging that capability. So we've had around 13,000 applications. I think we're over 1,000 people who've got through, so about 10%.
22,000 applications
rapidly.
And about 1,000 granted. That's about 3.5%.
Well, no, 22,000 where they've started the application. Completed application is about 13,000. Anyway, that will grow. Okay. My point being is, when you have a malign state like Russia that sees the UK as leading the coordination effort into, we've just discussed it, military, lethal, defensive weapons.
OK, but the question is not about
sanctions.
that. It's about refugees.
Yes, but when there's a malign state that can use this particular issue to send people over to the UK that can do us harm, we have to have some checks. We need to streamline that. We need to get better at it, and you will see that number increase of people we bring in. I'm very proud. I've got to tell you, we've had 104,000.
OK, let's let James back in.
No,
wait a minute. Let's let James back in.
No, we've only got about Hong Kong, Chinese Hong Kong who came over to the UK or have applications to come to the UK.
James.
I would say that, though, we've had 2 weeks of conflict, and we've known this has been coming for a while. Surely the planning should have been done in advance, knowing that this would be a problem and that there would be a humanitarian crisis.
Well, it started on Friday. It started last Friday, and by Friday night, people were coming in.
All right, let's let some other people on the panel answer. David.
I don't know where to start. I find this very, very, very sad. Just to remind people, in the build-up to the Second World War, most of Europe turned their backs on the Jewish people who were trying to flee. And in the wake of that, we became a country that took thousands of Ugandan Asians, thousands of Vietnamese boat people, thousands of Cypriots that I grew up with, many of them settled in North London. And time again, with this government and this Home Secretary, whether it's Windrush, whether it's how many we're taking from Syria, whether it's how many we're taking from Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was a summer of hell, frankly. And then now we have 22,000 people apparently who've applied, and just 300 who've got visas, people standing with their kids in Calais. And this Home Secretary could not get organised. Is it the best of Britain? Is this the best that we can do? Of course it's not. And Nadeem knows it. And we've got to get better on behalf of those people in the coming days.
Vadim Pistaico, can we hear your view?
Just one thing to add. I hope that our people, I understand that security checks should be done. I get it all. I just wanted to tell that most of our men are staying behind and fighting. So the most of the people you would see is just women with children, which I totally hope they're not posing any threat, especially terrorist threat to UK. So that's why I hope and I beg that the procedures will be dropped and every bureaucratic red tape should be cancelled. We will deal with later with any issues. Sometimes it's documents, but there is embassy here for you to help with the documents. Some people couldn't even get their passports because they are fleeing under bombardment. Thank you.
The woman here in the front with the glasses.
When the children in Ukraine fleeing the war do arrive in this country, what can we do and what will we be doing to help support them? I mean, they've left their education. Many of them may have experienced trauma, so what can we do to help support them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just mentioned it to the original question. We're preparing, I've got a whole team, as we did with the Afghan resettlement. So we've got 20,000 Afghan families who are here, settled, their children are now at schools. So I've got the same team. This will be much bigger. So we're planning for a capacity of, just with the family reunion route, of 100,000 children to make sure that we get them to be into schools as quickly as possible and supported, including, of course, trauma and additional support for their mental health as well as their education.
There's a man in the audience. I can see you've draped yourself in the Ukrainian flag there. You are Ukrainian, I assume?
I am Ukrainian, yeah. I arrived this country in 1999. I have my family. I am already British citizen. I'm very proud to be British citizen. I'm very proud to be Ukrainian. And I'm very... want to say thank you all British public for their support. You're great and we all feel that. But it's a lot of questions been asked and I want to ask them again because the answers is not very clear. Returning to the point of refugees, we had a consulate in Lviv which been shut down 1 or 2 days ago. And as you know, a lot of people fleeing from eastern part of Ukraine to Lviv, which is safe at the moment, and mainly women, mothers with kids who wants to come even as a family visits here, as you promised this program for family visits. So now they have to go to Poland, which is very difficult, as you know, that someone have to drive them there. As men not allowed to leave the country from 18 to 60 years old, they can't physically get there by themselves. Where you have to apply, where you have to spend, I don't know how many, I know that some people waiting up 10 days for decisions. So I don't know why you're creating this logistic problem where you had a very reasonable consulate where people could have applied and waited somewhere safe in their own country. And from there they could plan their journey to UK.
Helen.
Well, first of all, you said something that almost made me chuckle before when you said that Putin will think that the UK is leading the efforts against Russia right now. Of course it's not. The European Union is leading the effort against Russia, so I don't think they'll see Boris Johnson as a particular leader in this field. So just to set that straight.
It should be a team effort, coordinated,
Yeah,
which is this.
It's just because you said that Russia will see UK as a leader, and I don't know why they would do that. So that's one thing. The other thing is about the refugees. When I was the CEO of Save the Children, I learned something that I didn't realize before. And that is, every time you have a number of refugees, as a rule of thumb, 40 to 50% will be children. So if we have 1 million people who came out of Ukraine, you have about 400,000 of those who are children.
Well, it'll be even higher now because we're just looking at women and children.
Yes, exactly. So they are children. Let's just say half are children. And I think that has to play a role when we talk about how quickly we can process these visas. I don't want to be in a quarrel about whether you should have visas or not. The European Union member states do not. They don't ask for visas from the Ukrainians. But if the UK want to do that, fine. But it must be possible to do it faster because they're sitting somewhere, they have nowhere to stay. And let's just think, it is half of them, 40%, their children.
Let's take another question from Helen. Helen Charnley. Whereabouts are you, Helen? There you are.
What is the endgame in Ukraine? And is a negotiated settlement with compromise on both sides ever the right solution for the invasion of an independent sovereign state?
Look, Vadim, I'm going to come to you first. This is your country we're talking about. What is the end game in Ukraine? How do you see this playing out? Is there room for compromise, and should there be a compromise?
The principal decision of ours is that they have to get hell out of our territory and stop killing our people. All the compromises, we tried with them for 8 years in this long war after they came and took Crimea from Ukraine, and then came again, creating these republics and then recognizing the independence. Russians, unfortunately, burning down all the bridges for the compromises. As of now, we see no compromise. We have to fight immediately. But what we wanted to give is just diplomacy, a minute a day to work, allow us to create a situation when we can stop shooting at the particular moment, allow all civilians out, and hopefully reason Putin to get his forces out of Ukraine as well.
And what about the so-called breakaway regions, Donetsk, Luhansk? President Zelensky seemed to be suggesting there could be some compromise there. Obviously, Russia wants them to be recognised as independent states. Is there any room for manoeuvre there, do you think, or is that just off the table?
This was a sort of corner point of the whole Minsk agreement, that this status of these republics is not recognized by anybody. They are still part of Ukrainian territory. We could give them the special status. We could give more rights to them. Everything been asked and everything is in the list of so-called Minsk agreements. Unfortunately, now by recognizing that they are already independent states, he just burned down all the bridges. We just don't know how to start and restart these negotiations again. He can't take the recognition of independence back out of this. I don't know. I believe that he's created on a purpose. He didn't need to resolve all the issues. He didn't believe himself in a civil war he is calling. He just was creating one problem after another and then asking the ransom for his forgiveness. That's not how it works right now when he already killed so many of our countrymen.
Lawrence Friedman, what is the end game in Ukraine in your view?
I suspect there will be a negotiated outcome in the end, but as the ambassador has made clear, it's going to have to be based on Ukraine as a free, independent country with its own freely chosen government.
And that would mean, therefore, that President Putin, by his own avowed aims, will have lost. What does that look like? How worried should we be about that?
Well, it won't look very good for him, but he shouldn't have started it in the first place. I think the problem that you've got is trying to find forms of words that give reassurances. So, in fact, President Zelensky issued quite an interesting communique last night in which he's talked about some possible areas of compromise, including some sort of collective security arrangement for the region that might give Russia some of the assurances it needs that it's not going to be attacked from Ukraine, which of course it isn't going to be attacked from Ukraine anyway, but that might help. And there are, building on the Minsk agreements, possibilities there, all of which require the Russians to walk back from their maximum objective.
And just for those who aren't familiar with the Minsk agreements.
So the Minsk agreements there were two sets, first in September 14 and the second in February 15, after fighting. And the idea basically was that Putin wanted to use these two territories of Donetsk and Luhansk as ways of undermining the Kiev government, effectively. So he wanted them to be part of Ukraine with some sort of veto power over the government's policies. And that's why many of us were surprised by the sort of shifting position, because one thing they said they didn't want to do was to have them as independent statelets, which in fact would mean they would have to be subsidised thereafter from Russia.
Which is what they're suggesting now.
But that's a recent thing, so it may be easier for him to get off that. But we're talking about setting conditions which make it easier for Putin to retreat, and that's all we can do.
OK. The woman at the back there. Yes.
Sorry,
yes.
me. Oh, sorry. I was wondering, what would our relationship as a country after this conflict ends, what would it be like with Russia after all the sanctions we've imposed?
David Lanning.
Well, there will be an end point. There were sanctions against the horrendous, nasty apartheid regime in South Africa. And those sanctions eventually came to an end when we saw the end of that regime and the building of a democracy. So there can be no drawing back from the sanctions against Russia until we see a complete change of behaviour. But actually, I think until we see the end of Putin himself, and if anything, the sanctions are going to have to get a lot harder, not less hard. And we've got to enforce them and keep enforcing them.
Man here in the tartan shirt, yes.
We're facing someone who seemingly is prepared to risk it all. How do we negotiate with someone like that?
Hella?
This war will also end in negotiations. I am absolutely convinced about that. I think we should find hope that someone who attacks his neighbour and does it as brutally... I know that Putin has actually not lost wars, but this one he's going to lose because it's gone too far. So we should be very happy that we have the institutions to take over and do these kind of agreements. And we have NATO, we have the cooperation between the different countries, European Union, UK, all of those will be part of a negotiation at some state trying to back Ukraine. But I totally agree with David. We cannot go back on the sanctions. We have to show that Putin is up against a mighty enemy, not only militarily, but also economically, and we also got a superior system in terms of democracy and freedom. And those three things will mean that in the end, we will prevail, and it will be done at the negotiating table.
Man there in the blue shirt and glasses.
Yeah, we were talking about red lines, and our last question about sovereign states. Is Finland the red line? Not part of NATO?
It's a good question.
Not part of, I mean, I have a friend who I'm in contact with on Facebook who lives, you know, further south in Finland, and he is even saying it's too close for comfort.
Yeah.
Yes, because Finland, of course, is a neighbour of Russia.
Yeah. The difference between Finland and Ukraine is that Sweden and Finland have got a partnership agreement with NATO. And they have also done exercises together, and it is not they are not NATO members.
So what does that mean, Helen? Does that mean that if I mean, not we're predicting this, but if Russia should stray into Finland, does that mean that NATO then kicks in and supports it?
Not in the same way as if they're a NATO country, no.
Right,
but
okay.
there will be consequences. But if I was Finn, I would always also be a little bit nervous. That's why they should have been a member of NATO a long time ago.
Woman there in the glasses. Yes. You.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm going to ask a question that might seem like a utopian dream, but I think it has to be asked. We've seen wars in the past, and it's happening now, and in many parts of the world. And I thought that we've just gone through waves of COVID, and for me, that was the time for us to reflect and think about ways to ensure that high degrees of emotional intelligence were incorporated into international relations and geopolitics. Isn't it about time we started thinking about that? Not just for the global community, basically. Thank you.
And meaning what? That negotiations should be happening a different way, or I mean, obviously Putin has decided to do what he's done.
Yes, meaning that we should negotiate, and not just. I'm not just talking about the war in Ukraine. I'm talking about the global world and the global community in general. So actively trying to encourage ways to prevent us going into wars. Just trying to maintain peace. Basically, can we not do that in this world that we live in?
Can we do that in this world? I mean, we'd all like it. There's no question about that. And we're also talking about what could the end game in Ukraine look like. I mean, the government must have talked about this, about how you think this is going to end. Well,
it's got to end with Putin getting his tanks out of Ukraine, allowing the Ukrainian people to self-determine. They are a free people, a democratic people. And justice has to prevail. I think his biggest concern is actually Russian public opinion. We conducted an inquiry into UK-Russia relations back in 2014, as well as the work we did with Ukraine. He cares about public opinion, which is why the three main networks in Russia are either controlled by some proxies, but Putin people. And I think actually the Russian people are hurting. They're hurting because their children, their soldiers are dying in the Ukraine unnecessarily. Their economy has been crushed. David Lammy referred to his war chest halving because the ruble's been crushed. And I think ultimately, and I mentioned earlier, my family lived through Saddam Hussein's atrocities. It never ends well for dictators and despots. And I think ultimately he has to realise that Ukraine is free and independent.
Vadim, we haven't got long left at the programme, but given that you have been able to join us, if there was one thing you wanted the British public to hear from you this evening, what would it be?
Just, if I may, to answer, why wouldn't we, can all of us think about peace in the world? How can we, create something which will not allow wars to happen anymore? And why Ukraine is important to you here in UK? Just one thing, imagine so many nations are trying to build their nuclear capacities, which will be able to kill all living things on this earth. And we were one of those nations who actually gave up the nuclear weapons in return of your guarantee and United States and Russia that we will be defended. That's how important Ukraine for everybody here. That's why you have to defend it, to show everybody else that you can actually get rid of nuclear weapons and you still survive as a democratic nation with your own way to build up whatever you want to do as a nation itself. Thank you.
And do you, just out of interest, do you regret that decision now to give up Ukraine's nuclear weapons? I know it was in return for certain guarantees, but do you regret that now?
Many Ukrainians do. I understand as a professional diplomat that it was a good right step in the right direction to reduce the danger for all of us as civilization on this small planet. But many Ukrainians would ask themselves, what would be able to do right now to withstand this pressure? Even if they cross our border with one tank, if they know that we can have a nuclear response to what they are doing.
OK, we've got about a minute left. Let me just hear a little bit more from our audience. Yes, the man there in the blue shirt.
Yeah, thanks. It's just looking forward to the end game as we're talking about. Are we missing an opportunity here? We've seen all the anti-war protests going on across Russia with thousands protesting. Is there anything we can do to support that movement in terms of destabilising Putin from within?
Is there a role for social media in this, Helen? I'm just thinking in terms of, obviously, you're on the Facebook oversight board. We've only got about 30 seconds. You have to be pretty quick, I'm afraid.
It is so important that the Russian opposition gets supported from us. One of the things I suggested back in Copenhagen is that we name the street of where the Russian embassy is, Boris Nemtsov Street, because that's a way of really saying to the Russian opposition that we want you to succeed and we're still behind you. So that's a suggestion for the UK as well.
Okay.
And also, in terms of social media, we must make sure that people have access to communicate via social media. And there is right now a standoff between social media and the Russian authorities.
Okay. I'm afraid I'm going to have to end it there because our time is up. Thank you very much, everyone. Let me just tell you what we'll be doing next week. We'll be back on our usual Thursday night slot. We'll be in Kettering next week. That's the 17th of March. The week after that, we're in Reading. So if you're in Kettering already, do come and please be part of our programme. You can go to the Question Time website, part of the BBC website, and follow the instructions there and come and be part of our programme. I suspect we'll still be talking about Ukraine. I'd like to think that we won't be, but I suspect we will be. Thank you very much to the panel for coming this evening. Ambassador, thank you so much for breaking off your schedule and joining us. We very much appreciate it. And to the audience here in London, thank you very much for being part of the programme. Thank you at home as well for watching from Question Time. Bye-bye.